Hello and welcome to the Data Dimensions webinar series, brought to you by the Master of Science in Data Analytics and Policy Program and the Johns Hopkins University Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features a discussion on harnessing data for city management. Please note today's event will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the Data Dimensions playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function and we will answer as many questions as possible during the latter portion of the event. With that, I will turn over the presentation to our moderator, Dr. Collin Paschall, Program Director and Senior Lecturer for the Master of Science in Data Analytics and Policy Program.
All right, well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Natalie, for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here today, and thank you for everyone who's joining us online. And again, this talk will be recorded, so if you missed anything or if you'd like to share this with anybody in your network afterwards, it will be available on our YouTube channel. As Natalie mentioned, my name is Collin Paschall. I'm the Program Director for the Data Analytics and Policy Program. I'm joined here by my colleague, Chris Krompart, who is the Assistant Program Director of the Data Analytics and Policy Program, also at Johns Hopkins University. And we're really pleased to be joined also by Dave Gottesman, our guest today. Dave is the Assistant City Manager of Rockville, Maryland, where he's responsible for project and performance management for the entire scope of city departments and services. And prior to that, he was the CountyStat Manager for Montgomery County, Maryland, in the Office of the County Executive and in the Office of Management and Budget. Dave has a wide variety of experience across local government, leveraging data analytics and management for performance management and other governmental functions. And we're looking forward to the conversation today where we'll learn more about his background and his insights into how data analytics can inform evidence-based decision-making and management at the local government level. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dave and ask him to start with by just giving us a brief overview of his role right now at the city of Rockville and introduce us to the things that he's up to in his specific role in the agency and in the city today. Thank you, Dave.
Thanks, Collin. Thank you, everybody. It's really nice to be with you today. As was mentioned, my name is Dave Gottesman. I'm the Assistant City Manager here in Rockville, Maryland, which is the county seat of Montgomery County, my prior employer, just outside of Washington, D.C. Rockville is a city of about 70,000 folks, commonly cited or recognized as one of the most diverse communities in the country. With an excellent quality of life, park system, et cetera, all the things the local government does, we hope that we do well. One of the reasons I'm here is because one of the things the city wanted to better a number of years ago was performance management work and leveraging our data and so forth. And I've been here a little over 3 years, and as anybody in local government will tell you, that is kind of a blink of an eye, and we're still working on all of those kinds of initiatives. But I'm going to talk today about some of my time in Montgomery County, which had a much more mature program in this respect. Before that, I was with a township in New York. My first job in local government was with North Hempstead, New York, which wanted to start a stat program from scratch. And they hired me to do that before coming to Montgomery County. And then about 3 years ago, I basically reached a point in my career, as many people do, where you kind of hit a crossroads where you need to either decide to go deep or go broad. And going deep at that point would have meant going really kind of, head first into performance management, data analytics, even more than I had been. And I made actually the decision to go broad and going more into broader city management with a specialization, if you will, in performance management, bringing that experience to Rockville, to a place that really wanted to do it more.
Great. Thank you for that introduction, Dave. I wanted to start by asking you a very concrete question. I think for many people, the application of data analytics in government is an abstract matter. We hear it's a good idea. We all want to make better evidence-informed decisions. But I wonder if you could give me an example or two from your career, either in Rockville or previously when you were working for Montgomery County, where evidence was really collected and used and applied in a manner that you think really affected citizen well-being or governmental functions. Can you think of any specific examples that come to mind?
Sure. So I'll preface it by saying when I first got into this field, This is 2008, 2009. It was really coming into its own, and local governments around the country were seeing primarily what Martin O'Malley was doing in Baltimore with CityStat, the advent of the meetings and the application of data and using that data for accountability and transparency purposes, and basically using it as a management tool and a management philosophy. And in that era, city managers and mayors and town supervisors across the country were seeing what was happening in Baltimore and making pilgrimages and field trips, to see it in action and coming back to their home jurisdictions and saying, we want to do this, we want to apply this here. And I was really at a part of that movement at the very beginning. But when I explained what it was all about, what I was doing here to people, friends and family outside of local government, maybe they were private sector people or mid late career people, the reaction was like duh, like of course you want to do that. Like, why? How could you manage your operations or your organization in any other way except using data and evidence? But in local government particularly, it still was a new idea, and it was still this idea that we can't or shouldn't be managing our operations by gut or intuition or because somebody felt a certain way. Not a concrete example, which I'll get to in a minute, but the classic example of this movement, which I think still holds true because a lot of local governments just aren't there yet, and that's okay, was this idea that you were in a city or you were in a county or a town where there was this apparent need or this gut feeling that we need to build a new firehouse, for example, and somebody would say, okay, well, where should we build it? Where should this new facility go? And the fire chief would say, oh, well, he'd look at the map and he'd say, it's got to go here. It's got to go right there. And why? Well, why should it go there? This is a big, multi-million-dollar investment of public funds. It's a big decision. Why there? And he would typically say things like, well, there was a really bad fire there last year, or every time I go to that part of the county, people yell at me, and those meetings are never fun. So I think that's where it should go. And because of that position of authority or that institutional knowledge, people would just go along with it. And local government finally reached a point where that's just not good enough anymore. If you're going to guide a decision like that, especially where you're investing a lot of money in something that's lasting, a capital project or something, you have to bring the data to bear, right? So if that decision were to be made today, instead of just relying on personal anecdote or experience of somebody, even somebody in authority, you would start looking at census data for population trends. You would start looking at growth patterns. You would start looking at response times for 911 calls, and that kind of hard data and evidence to make a more informed, more defensible decision. So that's sort of the story. Some of the experiences in Montgomery County were things like Vision Zero related. That's a good example. So Vision Zero, or if you're not familiar with it, that's pedestrian. That is bringing the number of pedestrian and biker fatalities and serious injuries from whatever it is at the time to zero, right? And this is a global movement started in Europe, and it's caught fire all across America, where there's this commitment to pedestrian and biker safety, using data to change practices, to do all sorts of interventions. And it's an interesting example because it's not the responsibility of just one department, right? It's not the Department of Pedestrian Safety. But if you're going to move the needle on that kind of a big initiative, you need to involve all sorts of stakeholders across the government. You have to involve what they call the three E's, the engineers who build roads and sidewalks and crosswalks. You have to involve enforcement, which is public safety, traffic stops and so forth. And then the third E is education. So how do you get the word out there about safe driving practices or a new bike lane or all kinds of things? So unless you have those three E's working in concert and aligned, you're not really going to make progress. But all of that progress needs to be driven by data and evidence. So when I was at the county, we were really getting serious about this. And one of the data points that stuck out because we would have these recurring meetings with these stakeholders was we were seeing progress in certain areas. Some of the little quirks in the data were geographic. So if you're into local government, you may work or know of a place where jurisdiction and responsibility can be a patchwork in some places. So, for example, in Montgomery County, any given road might be controlled by a city like Rockville, might be controlled by the county, and many of the bigger multi-lane routes are state routes still. So, like 355, which is Rockville Pike near where I'm sitting now, is a state-controlled road, and we know from the data that the high incident areas are typically state roads. The data will continue to bear that out. So that means going to Annapolis and advocating to our state partners that there are certain changes that we need to be made, but we at the county level or the municipal level don't have the authority, to do that. So that's one way of using data to direct efforts. And then a more concrete example that we experienced was we did in our reviews of the data, we were seeing this is a number of years ago, but we were seeing progress in many areas along particular roads and intersections that we were monitoring. But one of the areas where the data was telling us we were not making progress, we were actually kind of stagnant or backsliding even, was in parking lots. And you wouldn't know that unless you peeled back layers of the data and really, did that deeper analysis. So what that data discovery led us to was a change in strategy when it came to parking lots, primarily around education, right? Because you can't necessarily re-engineer a parking lot, and you're not going to station a cop all the time in a parking lot. But the E that really could have an impact here was education. So the county did a big campaign about, awareness of when you're backing up out of parking spots, and I think it was called Heads Up or something like that. And it was very impactful. And we could see changes in the data after that campaign was pushed out there to the public. We could see the impact that it was having and see the effect on parking lots and a reduction in accidents in those locations. And all of that was driven by the data, insights that we never would have gotten if we weren't tracking, analyzing, and reporting on, and meeting and discussing actively what was going on.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. I think that's such a wonderful example. And it also illustrates a point that I've come across from talking to other, local government practitioners and leaders that at the local government level, you are dealing with very practical issues, like how to reduce the number of accidents in a parking lot. But this is not a small issue. I mean, if you think about it over the years, I mean, that is a lot of property damage, a lot of stress and anxiety, and a lot of, disruption in your citizens' lives. So, I mean, if you can reduce that, I mean, that's a very tangible benefit. And that's one of the things I always found very attractive when talking to folks that work in your, I don't know, industry is the wrong word, but sector, just the immediate practical benefits that data-driven insights can have. I will also attest that crossing 355 as a pedestrian can be a very fraught endeavor. So anything you can do to make that safer, I am fully in support of. But I think Chris has a question to follow up with next.
Just sort of riffing on what Collin said there. So I lived in Montgomery Village for a little while, so I can picture, Dave, some of what you're talking about in that same area, Montgomery Village being not that far from Rockville, for those who aren't familiar with it. So now then I think about sort of the bike traffic lanes and parking lots. It's like, oh, Dave might have been behind a little bit of that. But to kind of complicate a little bit what Collin was just saying there about how very practical, tangible, when we think about, local government and the local level, almost what you're describing is kind of like a worldview, like it's a data-inspired, data-informed worldview. And when you're thinking at the local level, there might be alternative worldviews for whatever reason. I won't kind of psychoanalyze that, but I was wondering if you could kind of talk a little bit about your experience of working with others who shared that worldview. Were you able to help develop that in others? Did you have any surprising allies who shared that worldview and maybe you disagreed about other things? But yeah, just if you could talk a little bit about your experience with that.
Sure. So local government is an interesting space. Most people here in City Hall, and I worked with the county and probably in local governments all across the country, I don't think anybody ever grew up wanting to be in it or realizing that it was a legit career path. I feel like everybody here kind of fell into it in one way or the other, myself included. Unless you were a kid and you wanted to be a cop or a librarian or something like that, you probably had no idea what local government was or is. And it's sort of like this invisible layer, right? Overall, over every community that we're in, it actually impacts people's lives more than any other level of government, which is a weird thing to say here in the DC area because the federal government is sort of the big dog. At least here, when you say the word government, people are like, oh, the federal government. But local government actually, from a day-to-day standpoint, certainly impacts people's lives more. It's all about quality of life. It's all about creating communities that people want to be in. It's all about having the nice park to go to, or making sure that your streets are plowed after it snows, or that your recycling gets picked up, or that the land use is appropriate and you have attractive, inviting places to be. And it's just not something that occurs to a lot of people, even grown-ups, or live somewhere. They might not even interact with their local government or think about it until they have to they want to put a fence around their house and they have to get a permit, or a speeding camera ticket arrives at their house, or something like that. But it is a really, really impactful place. So the fact that it has adopted a desire generally to want to be more data informed, data driven, data curious, is a really, really, really good thing. I think the secret ingredient to doing it successfully in any city or county is it has to be supported by leadership. And that could be elected leadership or that could be appointed leadership. Hopefully it's both. But that, I think what your question was about, sort of like finding like-minded people, I think. So in this area, I think we're blessed. So when I was in New York, and again, this was kind of early days in this field, but this is 2008 to about 2012. It was difficult for me to find like-minded people in my peer jurisdictions. New York City was doing it and is doing it. And New York City has always been far ahead of everybody with the MMR, the Mayor's Management Report, or the Mayor's Office of Data Analytics that Mike Bloomberg started. It's always been much more progressive, but they also have a ton more resources than any other local government does. So working in North Hempstead, it was really challenging to find peers who had either my title or my responsibility in the neighborhood, so to speak. When I came to Montgomery County, Maryland, we are blessed with this really great network, active network of local governments, cities, counties, in the DMV or the NCR, the National Capital Region, that had been and still are investing in this work. So I sought out when I sought out people who were doing this work to be able to not just network but bounce ideas off of or share ideas, frustrations, etc. It was so much easier. And we actually have a group that we formed 11 or 12 years ago called Mid-Atlantic StatNet, which is a informal. We don't have a mandate or a budget, but we meet twice a year, every spring and fall. And these are the stat, performance management, and data analytics practitioners across the entire National Capital Region. And we get 50, 60, 75 people to show up in person at a host jurisdiction twice a year. And we talk about this kind of stuff. We talk about what technologies we're using. We talk about how we deal with electeds. We talk about trends. We talk about AI. Of course, all the things that are going on to keep this field moving forward, including recruiting and where are we getting the next generation from. So the like-minded people are out there at the work level, the staff level for sure. But to make it succeed, and I think you are seeing more and more of this. You just have to have a mayor or a chief administrative officer or a city manager that also is a true believer.
A follow-up question to that. One thing that comes to mind is, Montgomery County is obviously a very large, densely populated, economically very vibrant. Rockville, similarly, economically successful, a lot of high income knowledge workers that work in this region. A very good candidate, as you said, for the application of data and sort of forward-thinking policies about how to inform data-driven decision-making. I do wonder, in your experience, networking with professional colleagues from other parts of the country, perhaps, where there's just lower population, lower resources. I'm thinking, the Mountain West or the Deep South, or really any part of the country, or even Western Maryland for that matter. What are some of the challenges that you're aware of that they confront, and how would you advise them to start sort of a data-driven journey if there really is not a lot of infrastructure and maybe not even a lot of resources to begin with in settings like that? What do those conversations sound like in your experience?
So that's a really good question. And I feel fortunate that I've been exposed to some of that since coming to Rockville and getting more involved with ICMA, the International City County Managers Association, because many of those kind of communities that you describe are members there. So going to their conference now every year and participating in sessions and even leading some sessions on that topic, you are seeing the the pain points, but you're also seeing the desire. So for a local government that wants to wrap its arms around this, I think the best advice is to pick an issue that people care about. You're never going to eat the whole elephant all at once. It's just not possible, especially with either limited resources, or you don't even have a person on your entire staff who's called a data analyst, yet, but you just don't have the technical skills per se. I think that you just don't need to overcomplicate it. So let's say you are Mountain West, or you're somewhere where there is some issue that is just on everybody's mind. And typically when I say everyone, it's elected leadership, or there's something that crops up in the newspaper. There's just some sticky pain point. It could be about zoning, or it could be about traffic, or it could be about public safety. Whatever it is, just pick one. And then it's important to identify what administrative data the jurisdiction has. And typically that's an easy start. There are a lot of rabbit holes, and it's not, I don't want to oversimplify it, but one thing that governments are really good at is collecting data. And, we collectively, local governments, have any number of systems that are constantly churning and storing data because, we run on systems. So even like, so the city of Rockville here, for example, one of the first things I did when I got here, because I wanted to understand where valuable data might reside, is I went around to all the departments and certainly our IT department as well. And I asked for, let's see the list of applications. And you may or may not be surprised, but even in a city like Rockville, which is 70,000 residents, about 450 FTEs, we have like 300 applications, across the city government that do stuff, and that means, when I say do stuff, it's, intake of information, managing projects, anything from payroll to constituent services to building inspections, right? Whatever we do, that information is stored somewhere. Now, in some places, it's just a spreadsheet, right? That's just the reality. But in other places, they've invested in some kind of software that manages whatever the operation is. And the challenge is typically you might have dozens or hundreds of applications in a government, and they don't talk to each other, right? They're all standalone, they're all siloed, and that's typically a challenge. But that means that you're not starting from zero. You have data about that issue, whatever that issue is that you want to tackle. You got to identify what systems work, touch it, what kind of data is in there, what does it look like, how do I extract it or analyze it or make use of it. And it does take a lot of patience. It also takes a lot of interpersonal time and effort. We spent at CountyStat in Montgomery County, which was a mature, accepted, function in county government, we still had to work a tremendous amount of time on relationship management, building trust, building reputation, that we are, here to assist. Even though performance management has a reputation of being all about oversight, which makes people very skittish, to engage. We really positioned ourselves more as we are here to help you leverage the data that you're sitting on top of. And then you finally eventually get to an attitude where it's like, shame on us if we're not leveraging the data that we own, that we already have. We don't have to go out and find it. We own it, and there needs to often be an effort where you go into departments and identify who the data stewards are for any particular effort. So let's say we're talking about building inspections, very common issue in local government, right? They take too long, or they bounce back between, a resident who wants to do something and something's not clear. So there's a lot of like hot potato back and forth. There's whatever the issue is. There's somebody in the organization that is the data steward who is responsible for knowing where the data resides. They're using it, and then it's about taking that use of it and leveraging it at a higher level. So the other piece of good news for a lot of organizations is the analysis doesn't necessarily require something super complicated, right? Like Tableau is amazing. There's all these great tools that exist and people can use, but a lot of local governments, maybe they're just Microsoft customers and they've got the Microsoft suite. There is so much you can do in Excel. There's even more you can do in Power BI. So you either need to identify the person or persons in your organization that know the tools and maybe give them a fun little sidebar assignment, or you create the role. You create the data analyst role, and there's any number of good job descriptions out there in the world that identify the hard skills. Technical skills are sort of the foundation of all of this, but I would argue that even more important than the technical skills, because they can be learned, are the people skills, the softer interpersonal skills. The people that I've seen who are really, really successful in this work as analysts are people who are more than anything else naturally curious. They're the people who can do a ride along with a snowplow operator and say, why do you plow this way? Why this way, not that way? And have those conversations because they're naturally wanting to know why something is done the way it is. And the worst, I think people might know this, is a little cliche, but the whole like, this is the way we've always done it response is like the worst thing in the world for a local government that wants to progress and make change and do good things. But they want to know, these naturally curious people want to know, why do we do it this way? Have we thought about doing it that way? And isn't afraid to ask questions and poke at it and peel back the layers of the onion and so forth. If you marry that curiosity with a natural inclination towards public service and improving communities, which is also an intangible that is so valuable, with technical skills and good interpersonal skills, because you can't do this job sitting in front of a computer all day, even though the analysis is a critical part and takes a lot of time and patience. If you can find those people, and they are absolutely out there, they're probably on this call, those are the people that are going to be the most successful and make the ripples of change faster and more effectively than anyone else.
Yeah, I very often tell our students in their master's degree program that you need to know your data in a descriptive sense before you can even begin to bring any sort of heavy hitting analysis to it. But you're making an additional point, which I think is very appropriate, which is that it's not just knowing your data, it's knowing how your data are generated in a sense. You want to know the operations of the city and be able to really be sensitive to new opportunities to collect data or to understand processes, which can then trickle upwards to a more advanced kinds of analysis. So that makes a lot of sense. I actually want to turn over to a question which I think a bit related to your comments, and also if any other audience members have questions, feel free to drop them in at any time. But we have a question from, and I'm sorry if I'm going to get this name incorrect, but we have a question from Favor, who asks, "Hi, I'm a senior studying data analytics and business intelligence. I'm passionate about using data to inform executive decisions, but I'm torn between pursuing an MPA for broader public systems leadership or a master's in healthcare administration for healthcare specific leadership. I know your work is more centered on public systems, but based on what you've seen, what experiences would help someone like me test which path is the right fit?" So really asking about sort of the pathway into public service and learning more about that at this very early stage of a career.
Yeah, that is a great question. And I'm going to just put in the caveat that I don't want to be responsible for Favor's career trajectory. I'll offer my take on it, but it's a very personal decision, right? Especially something like healthcare, which which is a growth field, right? So that's something to consider in this country. And as America ages, healthcare is one of those areas that there's going to be opportunity in the coming years. So I mean, I'm a little biased. I'm an MPA, and I appreciate the MPA because it is a really versatile degree. And I am grateful that when I finished my MPA, it was 2008. It was right into the jaws of the recession. And the career path that I had in mind coming out of grad school as a career changer in my 30s completely disappeared in the recession. And because the MPA is a versatile, broad-based kind of degree, and I had taken a course in performance management, that is literally what allowed me to get my first job in government in a really, really bad economic downturn in 2008. So I'm a little bit biased, but my experience with healthcare data is it can be super rewarding. Montgomery County, I can't say where they are right now because I've been removed from that organization for a few years. But when I got there, it was really clear that the county's HHS department, which is an enormous department in Montgomery County, it actually subsumes certain state functions that if you lived anywhere in Maryland outside of Montgomery County, you would go to the state for. But because Montgomery County's HHS was this big behemoth, the range of services was astounding. I mean, everything from crisis services to senior services, children, youth, and families, to dental care, to obviously in COVID, all of the vaccinations. I mean, a huge organization. And navigating services was always challenging, and understand and leveraging the massive amounts of data that the department was collecting was a huge challenge. And I can't swear to where they are right now. I don't want to pretend to know, but there was a year when I left, a concerted effort to start knitting together some of these disparate healthcare data sets to be able to do a better job helping people navigate, helping people. I don't know if I go so far as to call it predictive analytics, but having an understanding that if somebody enters the system over here because of a crisis, how likely are they to still be or end up back in the system over here for some issue that could have been avoided if we dealt with it further upstream? So that I'm trying to remember. I think it was Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, that Montgomery County was looking at as a forward thinker, a leader in this space. So I would recommend broadly to Favor to find the organizations, the jurisdictions that are doing this work well, or just trying to do it, like a Montgomery County, like a Allegheny County, and seeing how they are leveraging their healthcare or their health department data. And maybe that would kind of enlighten you to what's going on out there in terms of practice, in terms of opportunity, just to help you make that decision. Yeah, I'd like to say that you can't go wrong with either choice, but again, I'm a little bit biased.
Great, thank you. I think Chris has another question that he wanted to follow up on. So Chris?
Yeah, Dave. So this is all really fascinating. And so I just wanted to sort of bring in another angle of it, and that's working with the public. And so I think, especially at the local level, you've kind of described how people are often surprised, like what their government is doing. And I'm certain they're probably surprised, like just the sheer amount of data that's associated with it. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, if there's any stories about your interactions with the public, and whether this is like someone coming to you, or if it was like a town hall, sort of where there was like a new way of thinking about problems or solutions, but also kind of the role of democratic legitimacy in all of this, like the importance of people knowing that their government is doing this and being responsive to it. But if you could just kind of talk about that angle and the interpersonal skills associated with that.
Sure. So again, I'm going to lean on my Montgomery County example. One of the things that the county got very invested in my time there was what you call open data. And open data, if you're not familiar with it, is this idea that the public sector data belongs to everyone. And even though obviously there are things that would be redacted and PII, health information, personally identifiable information, and so forth, it's really important that the public and the residents know what their tax money is going to, essentially, right? Know what's being done on their behalf and so forth. So open data is this idea that governments adopted probably starting about 15 years ago, where they would take the data sets from these administrative systems or these applications and liberate it, so to speak, put it out into the public domain in an organized way so that it wasn't just analysts, government analysts that had access to useful or potentially useful information, but the general public did as well. So the county did it in a very organized, deliberate fashion, where the first thing we did was identify, what could be, what are all the different data sets, hundreds and hundreds that might have some public interest or some public value. And then one of the things that I did there, along with our innovation officer at the time, was we would go through these data sets and we would rate and rank them in a very systematic way that identified things like internal value, like, hey, if we put this on open data from Department A, would Department B look at it and say, oh, we can use this too? And also public value, could a resident or a small business or some entrepreneur and the public take this data and do something meaningful with it as well, build an app or something like that. And we would create this scorecard, because what we were seeing other governments doing was taking all of these data sets and just throwing everything up against the wall and just seeing what sticks. And just, cleaning and publishing and maintaining an open data set is still a lot of effort. So we just wanted to take a more deliberate, intentional approach to all of that. And over the years, we did, and the county still continues to publish new data sets every year. But what we did is we created this ranking system so that we were ostensibly publishing the most high value data first. One of the interesting public engagement elements of that was, and I can't take credit, this belongs to the person who was running the open data program from the technology side at the time, is, you can put this stuff on a website, but like, so what, right? Are people going to use it? And what she did, it was a brilliant idea. One of the departments in county government is libraries, public libraries. And what do librarians know best? They know how to organize information. They know how to categorize information. That's one of their chief skill sets. Because when you talk about how libraries, systematically organize their offerings. So she worked with our librarians to do kind of a taxonomy of all these different data sets that we were publishing and organize it in a way that the public could appreciate it and understand it and ingest it, and then did all manner of public engagement where we brought people in and sat them in front of the open data system so that people could play around with it and see, can they navigate it? Can they download a data set? Can they make a chart? All these tools that were built into the system, but are people going to use it? Is it easy? So that was a really, really great public engagement tool. We all have access to census data. That's another, to engage the public. Like a lot of jurisdictions, Rockville does we do it every 2 years. Some places do it every year, a big public quality of life survey, right? There's firms out there that do this kind of stuff. So every other year we do a big engagement survey. Or not engagement, I'm sorry, like satisfaction with public services. Are you happy with the way the government's operating? And that provides a lot of really useful data that we can turn around and say to the public, we hear you, you're satisfied with this, but we could do better here. So there's lots of different opportunity there.
Thanks, Dave. We have a couple of questions in the QA. I'm going to just kind of sort of synthesize and hopefully not too repetitive of your previous answer, but the questions are basically about sort of like, what are the skills that you would like a new entry-level person to bring to a position like this? And I would also add, like, one thing is sort of technical skills, and you also mentioned soft skills, but also like, what are some of the things that you think sort of an entry-level position would be doing in their day-to-day if they were, to come to work for the city of Rockville? What's sort of like the task set that you might be asking them to do 1 month, 3 months, 6 months into a new role?
It's a great question. And I wish I had an FTE, a position to bring, to hire somebody to do that kind of work day to day. I find myself doing some of it. Sometimes I rely on somebody in a department who's, good with analysis. But my goal here is to someday create a performance management data analyst position. I mean, maybe a team, but, you got to start with one. So there's a couple parts of that question, but I'm gonna kick it off with a quick story that I think illustrates so much of what we're looking for in the job. And I'm gonna give credit where credit is due. I heard this story years ago from a guy named Michael Flowers. Michael Flowers was the first person that Mike Bloomberg, mayor of New York City at the time, hired to run the mayor's office of data analytics, which is like the office we all dream about in local government. We all wish we had this office. And this is the office that isn't responsible for performance management and reviewing metrics to see if we're doing okay. This is the office that's responsible for creatively layering and leveraging data to form insights. This is the office that might layer building code inspection data with fire response data to understand that in this part of the city, this in a building like this, we're 3 times more likely to have a fire because when 2 apartments fail their inspection, or something like that, right? Taking these disparate data sets and layering them to generate insights. That's like the promised land for a lot of places. But Mike told this incredible story that has always stuck with me and has guided my hiring decisions ever since in this area, where when he got the office stood up, and then at some point he got the green light to hire his first analyst. You can imagine the level of not just dedication to New York City and public service that you would find there, but the caliber of technical skills that you would find in Manhattan, not just in Manhattan, I mean in New York City generally, in the 5 boroughs. So he was interviewing, the slew of candidates, and at most interviews you get to the part where you're just kind of making small talk at the end. And he said to this candidate, what do you like to do in your free time? And the candidate said, well, I love, one of the things I love to do is play fantasy baseball. And by the way, I've won my league the last 3 years. And Mike almost fell out of his chair, because if you know fantasy baseball, which I don't, or I don't do it, but if you ever do the March Madness basketball pools, if you win once in your life, that's an incredible accomplishment. But to win 3 years in a row, Mike was he just couldn't believe it. It was so out of the ordinary. So he got his interest, and he's kind of pulled the thread on that topic. And what he realized from talking to this candidate is when he was analyzing baseball data and all those spreadsheets, he wasn't just seeing numbers. He wasn't just seeing the number in the cell. He was seeing very naturally in his mind the player. He was seeing the batting. He was seeing the pitching. He was seeing the fielding. And what that data, what those numbers represented in real life. And that was the guy that Mike hired, because that skill of understanding the humanity behind the raw cold data is an incredible asset to this field. So even more so, I would argue, in local government, because we're dealing with people calling 911 in crisis, or 311 because they have an annoying thing like a pothole, on their street that they drive over every day to work. We're dealing with, child welfare. We're dealing with recreation programs, things that really, really touch people's day-to-day lives. So if you can look at government data and understand the humanity and the meaning that it represents, that is something that is all not, I don't want to say it's unteachable, but that's something that like comes naturally, more naturally to some people than others. So that's a huge skill. Other things that I mentioned earlier were curiosity, just like not like looking at the data and seeing that little quirk and really and not overlooking it, but saying like why, why is that? And the story that illustrates that to me in my mind is the CountyStat used to have an analyst that has whose career has really taken off because she's brilliant. But she told me the story when she was a new analyst in Montgomery County. One of the departments that in her portfolio was general services, and general services is a huge department in Montgomery County. Everything from building maintenance to construction to fleet services. And one of the things that she was analyzing was fleet data for our ride-on buses. So Montgomery County has a ride-on bus system, kind of partners with Metro Bus in DC. Huge buses. And in the fleet world, one of the very kind of standard performance metrics is mean distance between services, right? Between maintenance, So what you're striving to do is obviously lengthen it, right? So you get more mileage before the buses have to come in. And she was reviewing these spreadsheets that were downloaded out of the fleet system for the buses, and something just wasn't making sense, right? It was just like every once in a while the numbers would like start over or not add up. Like she was doing her analysis and it was driving her bonkers. Now, most people would be like, kind of like take it for granted, be like, well, I guess that's a quirk of the system. But she was persistent and she was curious, and she got up from her computer, went down to the fleet, the yard, and started talking to the mechanics. I mean, this is kind of what it takes. And what she learned is, in your car, where is your odometer? It's on the dashboard, right? It's right in front of you. But for some reason, completely unknown to me, in these big, huge municipal buses, the odometer is in the wheel well. I don't know why. Maybe that's where mechanics can get to it when they raise the buses, on the platforms. But what happens in the wheel well? Very often a rock gets kicked up by a tire, cracks the glass on it, and what does a mechanic do? They say, "Oh, we have a broken odometer. We got to take it out, put it back, put a new one in." And that was happening, as you would expect it to. But it was creating havoc in the data because every once in a while the numbers would go from whatever mileage to zero. And it was fine. And she didn't have that curiosity and that gumption to go and find out what the source of this weird quirk in the data was. Like she wouldn't have been able to do a proper analysis, which might again lead to like some good outcome and some problem solved. So I those two stories are just kind of two things that have stuck with me over the years. I would also say that patience is really important. You mentioned it yourself, Collin, about this idea of understanding the data you're looking at, right? So you download this huge data set, from a system, and it's got 58,000 rows and 57 columns. Like that would scare a lot of people, but if you're the kind of person that isn't going to be scared by that, that's step one. But then, yes, it's understanding what does each column mean? What does each row mean? What does it mean when there's a blank cell? What does it mean? All that kind of stuff, and really, really understanding what you're working with, the raw, because if you don't understand that, you can't turn it into something meaningful. Kind of part and parcel with that, I would also say the data visualization skills are very important. And this speaks to communicating data to non-technical audiences, right? So one of the greatest analysts I ever hired in my entire life had a beautiful eye for design. He wasn't just technically gifted and had all the other things I've been talking about, but he had a really great eye for using colors and the right chart type, right? Not everything's a bar graph, not everything's a pie chart, but there's so many great, there's dozens and dozens of options for the kind of graph and chart you can create that will intuitively communicate what you want to say, but you have to know what you want to say. Are you trying to show change over time? Are you trying to show a connection or a disconnect between something? Are you trying to, are you going to use I think it's called a Sankey diagram to show flow, right? Like, what are you trying to say? And do you have the ability to select the right chart type, the right colors, to be able to tell a succinct story, not just to your fellow analyst at the next desk or your boss, but to Joe Public or Jane Public? Can they pick up what you produce and say, oh, I get it, and that's a storytelling skill as well. So you did ask, because I also want to touch on what would a person do? So in this role, I would expect an entry-level analyst to be able to do all the things I've been talking about. But what does that look like? You get, your manager or a department head or, program manager, somebody in the organization hands you a problem, and they, and you have to be able to understand what that problem means, not just to the government, but to the residents. You have to understand and go identify what systems and applications touch it. Sometimes the data doesn't even exist, and you have to invent it. You have to start collecting it. You have to say, oh, we have to start asking this question, because we've never asked before. Or if we're going to disaggregate the data, we have to start asking about, renters versus owners, or race and ethnicity, or age, so that we can parse the data we're already collecting in a more helpful way. So you're attacking a problem, you're understanding what it is, you're understanding where the data resides that can illuminate the story, and then it's a lot of data wrangling, right? It's understanding what you have, what you might still need, what the data is telling you, what do I pull out of it, how do I convert it into something meaningful. And then it's also the repetition, right? Sometimes you have a monthly meeting about something and you have to recreate it. So are you skilled enough to be able to create something that you maybe don't have to reinvent it each month? Can you automate the data pull? Are you doing it in Power BI so that the chart just updates every time you turn it on? Can you share it out with somebody in a meaningful way? I think that at an entry level, no matter what job it is, doesn't matter if we're talking about data analytics or customer service, whatever organizations want problem solvers, right? They want people who are what they call GSPs, good, smart people, that are not afraid to take on a problem, that can think about it creatively, that can work well with others at all levels, of an organization, up and down the chain and across. From a day-to-day standpoint, it would be, someone in this position's job would be using data to solve problems, or identify opportunities that maybe wouldn't be apparent just by looking at the spreadsheet.
Well, this is the part of the presentation where I have to make my shameless pitch for the MS in data analytics and policy, because many of the things you talked about, data visualization, reproducible pipelines, automated reporting, outlier detection, data summaries, these are all skills that we actively encourage and develop in our curriculum. So if that's something that you're interested in enhancing your skills on, I welcome an email to my email address. You can look me up on Google very easily and find that. I'd be happy to talk to anyone who is looking to develop some of those skills. That shameless pitch aside, I do have we have one last question I think Chris is going to ask briefly, and then we're going to wrap up in just a couple minutes after this. So Chris, do you want to go ahead and show us off with the last thought-provoking question for us, please?
Yeah, no, as well, I don't know about thought-provoking, but I'll do my best. But yeah, as we approach the top of the hour, just thank you, Dave, for taking the time to talk with us. And this has been really interesting, and I'm sure we could probably talk for another hour. And also just to acknowledge clearly what an asset you are to the community of Rockville. And so they're lucky to have you, and we're lucky to have you for the time that we did today. But I think just to sort of wrap it up, do you have a recommendation for everyone here, in terms of a book that you think would really kind of extend some of the themes, or maybe a podcast, just what's something that you can leave us with, that if we want to learn a little bit more, what would you recommend?
It's a good question. So I am looking at my bookshelf right now. I'm not staring off into the distance. I've come across a lot of good ones over the years. I particularly like A More Beautiful Question, which is by Warren Berger. And Warren Berger's book is about, it's applicable to any sector. I feel like it has a private sector bent to it, but it's about this framework of like the 5 whys, right? Like not being afraid to kind of poke at something and say, well, why do you do it this way? Oh, because 10 years ago this happened. Well, why did it happen? And and eventually you keep asking why until you get to sort of the truth, the kernel of truth underneath it all. And then the next question is, what if? Like, what if we could make a world that looked different? What if we tried this? What if we did that? And then the third question in the framework is, how might we? Right? It opens up possibilities of thinking. Well, how might we change the organizational culture to allow this or facilitate that? I really like that one. There are a bunch of books about the field itself, like The Performance-Stat Potential by Bob Bain, who was like a really early thinker in this space. Moneyball for Government from Results for America. It is a lot of that's about like doing like the random control trials, in government, which is like that gold standard of like, we're sending out a mailing, for our tax bills. We're going to randomly send, 3 different kinds of letters to see what garners the best response or the highest return rate or something like that. So doing the RCTs is a that's a really good one. Results for America does tremendous work. Those are the first 3 that jumped out at me off the shelf. But as far as, podcasts and stuff, like there is a really good, Andrew Feldman, who has a podcast, the name of which escapes me. He's not going to be happy with me, but he's been doing these podcast interviews, practitioners in the field for years, for well over a decade. So there's probably so many of them collected, but I can get a link to you, Collin. Andrew Feldman is his name. He was in the federal government. He worked in state government, but he's been, as a personal interest, he's been doing these podcasts for interviews for years with people in the field. I think that's probably a good start.
Well, I think we all have our homework assignments for the balance of the spring here then, Dave. So thank you so much. This has been a really fantastic conversation. As Chris said, I echo the sentiment that it's really, frankly, inspiring to hear someone as dedicated to, performance management and city government as you are, being a public servant. And so it's really great to hear this perspective, to hear the practical advice you've given, and just a really engaging conversation. So we thank you very much for your time. I appreciate all the audience members who offered their questions, and we look forward to seeing you again down the road in a future edition of Data Dimensions. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks for the opportunity.